Hello, welcome to the Father Spitzer's Universe. We're at the intersection of faith and reason. I'm Doug Keck here in Irondale, Alabama, at the heart of EWTN on Mother Angelica Way, at our studios here. It's the mothership, and of course, Father Spitzer will join him momentarily out at Christ Cathedral Studios in Orange County, California. Today, we're going to be talking about, as a follow-up to our discussion of purgatory last week, we're going to talk about the evidence for the soul. And as always, we want to invite your questions to participate. Email us questions at spitzer'suniverse@ewtn.com. And of course, post your questions on our Facebook page at facebook.com/EWTN online, hashtag FSUniverse. And of course, if you'd like, you can also send us a tweet at twitter.com/EWTN, hashtag FSUniverse. And as always, for all things Father Spitzer, there's the Magis Center's website, magiscenter.com. So let's turn quickly to Father Spitzer at our West Coast studios as we see ourselves flying in to that beautiful setting where Father is ensconced in our studio, overlooking in the background. You can't see it there from that shot, but not that far from Disneyland, and also from the Angels ballpark as well is right nearby there. So you're really at the heart of what's going on out there in California. And here we are talking about soul. You know, I remember, I'm old enough to remember when people would say, does that man have soul or not have soul? So we have the question of the evidence of soul. But before we get there, here's a follow-up question from last week when we were talking about purgatory. Here a person writes to us and says, what do we say to somebody, Father, who claims that purgatory is just something that the church made up so that they could sell indulgences? We hear names like Tetzel, remember, and things like that. And so that seemed to be some of the stuff. We're living in the year of, you know, the anniversary for the Reformation. The Holy Father recently did something in relation to that in Sweden. And certainly one of the things we used to hear about was this whole idea of indulgences, and they were selling them so that they could raise money for building St. Peter's. And that's really where this whole purgatory thing came from. Before we move into our new topic, what about that?
Yeah, I mean, the response to that query is, please read history. That is just factually incorrect. The doctrine of purgatory way predates the indulgence controversy that preceded the Protestant Reformation. You know, so all of these kinds of controversies are coming up in the 1500s. The doctrine of purgatory is essentially developed in the 1100s, for the reasons that we mentioned last week. And just to remind the listeners, last week we were talking about what happens to a person who, has an imperfect contrition. In other words, he says his contrition, he's contrite out of fear, maybe fear of hell or fear of being out of the grace of God, etc., or some sense of emptiness without God. And but he still has these inordinate attachments, right? He still has this purification process that he needs to go through because of that imperfect contrition. How does God work? He has to work through our human freedom. And if that final purification process is anything like the purification process that takes place here on this earth, then of course our freedom is involved in it. God's going to give us the chance to utilize our freedom in order to become detached. Of course His grace is going to be present, helping us to become detached, and we are assured of our salvation. But this occurs, hundreds of years, the development of the doctrine of purgatory, hundreds of years before the indulgence controversy that's taking place in the 1500s. Now just back up for even a moment to what happened to purgatory before the 1100s, right? So what was purgatory about then? There was still the sincere belief in atonement for those who had died, that atonement was possible after death, that people could pray. The Christian church was praying for atonement of people after death, based upon Jesus's, advocacy of forgiveness after death in the age to come. So for all intents and purposes, doctrine of purgatory really goes back to the first century. It gets, kind of developed over the course course of time, the additional factor of God working through human freedom and the assurance of salvation as God works through human freedom in the event of imperfect contrition. That's already developed quite nicely in the 1100s. And of course, by the time the indulgence controversy came around, yes, there were some clerics that abused the doctrine of purgatory for the purposes of selling indulgences. There's no doubt about that's history. But let's face facts. There's another part of history, like the independent development of purgatory, completely independently of the indulgence controversy.
Okay.
So, just please, the easy response is, please read history. That'll take care of the problem. And, there's just no correlation between the two at all. As they say, it's a cheap shot and a straw man.
Right. Okay, very good. We're happy you feel so strongly about it there and made that point as vociferously as you did.
Yeah.
I have a feeling you've heard that book. I have a feeling you've answered that question before. So.
Well, it's not just that, but it really is the old straw man. Right. I'll throw out this piece of spaghetti, see if that sticks to the wall.
Right. When in doubt, come up with purgatory and indulgences.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let me ask you a question here. We're talking about the evidence for the soul, and what I wanted to ask you was for people to understand ourselves. We were kidding about it at the beginning of the show. Somebody's got soul. We hear about that expression. But when we talk about that from a Catholic theological perspective, what are we defining soul? Is it our life force, our essence? What is it?
Well, the soul, as the Church has defined it, is more than a life force.
Okay.
What it means is that we have some kind of transphysical, that means trans means above or beyond physical manifestation of our consciousness. So in other words, when our consciousness survives bodily death, right, that it has a transphysical dimension to it, right? We believe too that it not only has a transphysical dimension of consciousness, but even a transphysical dimension of embodiment. So there's something about our embodiment that also will survive bodily death. Now, in addition to that, the Church has added two other dimensions to it, which are very reasonable in light of the evidence that we're going to be talking about. The first is that the soul is that dimension of our being that not only survives bodily death, right, our consciousness that survives bodily death, our embodiment that survives bodily death, but also that it's the faculty through which transcendental awareness comes from. So this is the faculty where we actually are aware of perfect truth, perfect love, perfect beauty, perfect goodness or fairness, and perfect being or perfect home. Now that, these are the five transcendental desires, or the five transcendental awareness. This does not come from our physical brain, and it can't be reduced to our physical brain. And later on in the show, we're going to be talking about the evidence for that in the contemporary age. This is not just something that the Church asserted arbitrarily. There's very, very good reason for it. But attached to those five transcendental desires is the most fundamental desire and awareness of all. And that is the awareness of God Himself, the awareness of God's presence to us interiorly and, of course, exteriorly in providence, the awareness of the sacredness or holiness of God, the awareness that God is trying to communicate with us, to unite Himself to us, is inviting us closer to Himself, and of course that means that we are sanctified, made holy through being, drawing closer to God. That human beings know all of these things intuitively through this faculty that we call the soul. So we see three different dimensions to it already.
Okay.
It survives bodily death, both the consciousness and the embodiment, and it's no longer limited by the laws of physics when it survives bodily death. Number two, that it produces produces transcendental awareness of perfect truth, love, goodness, beauty, and home, which we'll talk about the evidence for in a minute. Number 3, that this is the faculty through which God is communicating to us directly. And there's very good evidence for this in what we call the Numinous Experience and the idea of the sacred. We'll talk about that later in the program, that yes, there is a fundamental interior human experience of God that this scholar Rudolf Otto calls the Numinous Experience in his very classic book, The Idea of the Holy, and we'll talk about that later. But that's a third dimension of the soul that the Church speaks about. There's also a fourth dimension of the soul that comes through Aristotelian philosophy, or Thomistic philosophy, really, because it was St. Thomas Aquinas' adaptation of Aristotle to the form. And this comes in the area of the relationship between what's called the soul and the brain, or what I call the soul and its brain, because as Thomas Aquinas correctly described it, the soul is the form, the organizing principle, right, that is drawing the human person, particularly the brain, but is drawing the human person to the kind of transcendental entity, to the kind of thinking, cognitional entity with what we call conceptual ideas, right, to the kind of entity that's going to be in communication with God, to the kind of self-conscious entity, and we're going to be talking about self-consciousness even more. So there is a very, very refined notion of the soul, and of course that very refined notion of the soul, as I started with earlier, survives bodily death. So when you survive bodily death, you're going to be self-conscious. You're going to have, an awareness of the memories you had on this earth. You're going to be able to remember what is going on and think about what's going on after your death. You're going to be completely transcendent of physical laws. You're going to still have the same transcendental capacities, the awareness of perfect truth, love, goodness, beauty, and home. The awareness of God will be intensified tremendously in that state. And of course, through it all, that soul is really the organizing principle of your body and your brain. Yes, genetics is also an organizing principle. That's going to, as it were, the genetic structure you have is going to lead to your brain development, your body development, and so forth. But it is the soul, literally, that is the telos, the final cause, that is pulling the brain beyond physical processes, is integrating the brain beyond merely physical processes to these transcendental processes, like the awareness of perfect truth, love, goodness, beauty, and home, but also to the thinking processes that we call self-consciousness, which cannot be explained by a physical process. We'll talk about that in a moment. And also to the idea of, what we might call the process of conceptual ideas and heuristic notions, which I'll explain later in the show. So yes, the Church has a very technical definition of the soul, but it is really the principle of our transcendence and the principle of our connection with God and the principle of our survival after bodily death. And what I mean by principle is a metaphysical principle, that is to say, the substance, the defining substance, right, that does all of these things and gives us all of these capacities. It's not like an ethical principle, it's a metaphysical principle.
Okay. Well, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do as the show goes on based on what you've said there. You
Exactly.
mentioned these things we're going to cover. I'm checking my watch saying how much time we're going to need. Let me ask you another question there. Are there different types of souls?
Well, in Thomistic and Aristotelian philosophy, there are. But what they mean by soul in this case is the organizing principle of the being. So, for example, is there a soul which is the organizing principle for life, what we would call an animalic soul? Yes, but that's very different from a human, self-conscious, transcendent soul. Okay. So that's a very, very different thing itself. So again, is there a soul, appropriate to plant life, to metabolism, to growth, and so forth? Yes. Aristotle would say, yes, there is. So you basically have one that's appropriate to life. You have a soul, a quote-unquote soul, an organizing principle that's appropriate to animal sensibility and animal awareness of pain and animal consciousness, right? And then you have a human soul, a rational soul, a self-conscious soul, a transcendental soul. So these are the various dimensions of the three kinds of soul that are admitted, but of course those views of soul as organizing principle are very different from what we mean in the technical sense by the human soul I was describing first in the program.
Well, that goes into the question that everybody wants to know: does Fido basically have a soul? Or if Fido has a soul, is it an immortal soul? Meaning, if I have these wonderful pets, will I see them in the next life? We've heard that, kind of bandied about in different ways, in the sense of whether that, in fact, they don't have an immortal soul, so they can't. And even the Holy Father, not that long ago, kind of inferred that yes, you will, or just the idea that, if that's what it takes for you to be perfectly happy, then I guess they'll be there. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, the kind of soul we're talking about in an animal soul, as I said before, is the organizing principle of their powers and their embodiment. So that kind of soul in an animal, there's nothing in that which per se is transcendent. And therefore, we have said there's nothing about an animal soul that is necessarily going to survive bodily death, because there's nothing transcendental in an animal soul. Now, that doesn't mean that God couldn't take an animal and allow an animal to live, in the resurrection. So for all intents and purposes, we see in Paul's letter to the Romans, I believe it's chapter 8, where he is actually talking about the whole creation is yearning for redemption, right, in God. So he's talking about this idea that God's going to bring everything, not just animals, but he's also going to bring rocks and grass into some sort of a next life a sort of redemption that Paul believes that God not only wants to do this, but after the fall, it's God's intention to do this so that creation is redeemed. So it's perfectly plausible, and it could be perfectly argued that a dog, for example, could be in the kingdom of heaven, and even my pet Fido could be in the kingdom of heaven. There's nothing about Aristotelian philosophy that precludes that from happening, but there's just nothing in Aristotelian philosophy that says it will happen from the transcendental nature of the soul. But there is a hint from Paul, from St. Paul, that it could happen, and because of the redemption of creation, and of course, what they say, God can do whatever He wishes, and there is nothing that precludes Him from making Fido be present in heaven. So for all intents and purposes, it's perfectly possible and even plausible that it could happen in light of St. Paul's views.
Okay, I think you made a lot of people happy out there. Thank you so much, Father. We're going to take a break and continue with our discussion. What is the evidence for the soul? Father Spitzer will delve more into this as we continue in Father Spitzer's universe. Stay with us. Much more ahead. And thank you so much for staying with us here at the intersection of faith and reason, Father Spitzer's universe. We're talking about the evidence for the soul, and we're going to go right to Father Spitzer and to a question we got from Facebook. Dear Father, will the souls in hell know the souls that are in heaven, and vice versa? I guess, will they be aware of each other? If so, how is it possible the souls in heaven will not be sad? Please explain. Thank you so much for Rosemary. who wrote that question. So let's say you know that your loved one didn't make it. Isn't that going to make you sad, or will you not be aware? Or do we know?
Yeah, first of all, yes. No, it's a great question. I mean, the soul's in heaven, and of course we believe that's going to be not only a soul, but a completely risen body in heaven. They would be aware of those who had chosen, of their own free will to go to a domain of their choosing. So, I mean, they would know that they chose, darkness and dominion, right, over love and light. They will know that they chose, to go away from God rather than towards God, and away from them, those who are in heaven, instead of towards them. Would this make them unhappy? The idea, of them, abusing their freedom and choosing this would have to make them sad, as it makes God sad. Anybody who chooses to go to hell would be sad, but that saddened nature, at the end of the day, is not going to interrupt, right? The joy that's in the kingdom of heaven, which is, of course, a sublime joy of being immersed in love. And of course you say, well, that means you have to, let that person go. And the answer is yes, you do have to let that person go according to their own choices. At some point, you do have to let a person make a choice, and you can't be eternally sad for the choice that they made, because the choice that they made was to move away from you, move away from God, and move away from essentially the blessedness of love in favor of getting, something that they want, namely, dominion, something like, autonomous power, something like ego satisfactions galore, something like the 7 deadly sins to the max. They're choosing what they think will make them happy.
Right.
And so from that vantage point, you can see, that you're going to have to let go. And it's the same thing, of course you care for people for the rest of your life. And you're going to hold them in your heart, and you're going to, hope the best for them. But to be frank with you, you're going to have to let go of the sadness that comes from their choice.
Okay.
You have to let go of that, and of course, but keep them, as loved in your heart.
Right. Well, let me ask you that too, because let's talk about the soul and the immortality of the soul in that way, because some religions believe in like soul extinction, the idea that you die and then let's say if you go to heaven your soul stays around, but if you go to hell it's just extinguished. And the idea, isn't that more merciful than this soul having to spend eternity suffering? What's the Catholic perspective?
Well, the Catholic perspective really is that extinction does not happen. The Catholic perspective is that the person is actually choosing what they think will make them happy, and God is essentially, though it saddens him profoundly, is letting them have their choice. They think they will be happier if they're away from God. They think they will be happier if they're not responsible to him. They think they will be happier if they get the 7 deadly sins galore, right? They think they will be happier in the darkness. And of course, when they think that, they say, I'm choosing this reality that I think will make me happy. I know that it will profoundly sadden the people, who've been pulling for me to get to heaven, but I really don't want to get there. And I really don't want to be in relationship with God. And so, be that as it may, even though it'll sadden God, even though it'll sadden, my relatives, even though I won't be able to see them, I'll get what I really, really want. And so, of course, God gives them that. And of course, is there emptiness in this? Absolutely. Who can live in a state devoid of love, even if it is, by their own choosing? Who can ultimately live in a state of alienation from self and others, even if you do think it's going to bring you the pleasures of the 7 deadly sins, but apparently in that calculus, people actually are capable, at least this is what the doctrine says, are capable of choosing to go in favor of the 7 deadly sins instead of God, instead of love, instead of others. It's a fictitious happiness, and of course it certainly is filled with emptiness and alienation and darkness, but they choose it, and there it is. Can we be sure that somebody is in hell? Well, the Catholic Church just teaches, you should never, put yourself in the place of God and judge whether somebody is in hell, or some person is in hell. That's not up to you. That's up to God, who judges the freedom of a particular person and grants them, as it were, their heart's desire, which of course is, this profound and bizarre, perversion of happiness and a perversion of what it means to be fulfilled.
Okay, very good. Here's a question. It's a little, it's related but a little bit different. It says, "Hi, Father. I have a family member who has gotten involved in a religion that most of Christianity would define, let's say, as being a cult." Okay, so that whole soul extinction kind of relates to some cults out there. What should I be doing to help this family member who is committed to their new religion? I'm very concerned for this person's soul. And this is from Phyllis. So obviously it's kind of related.
Yeah. Phyllis, if you saw the program last week and you kind of remember those 3 requirements for a mortal sin, grievous matter, right? Sufficient reflection and full consent of the will. It's pretty clear that relative seems to not, fully consent to the will of denying, God. That they're trying to really pursue God, but somehow they're really in an erroneous pattern. So in other words, they're not sufficiently reflective. They don't have full consent of the will. So they go to this other religion, thinking that they are pursuing God and thinking, that they're trying to follow their own conscience in pursuing God. And the Catholic Church actually does consider this in the documents of Vatican II, both in Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes, but it does it in the context of other religions. And so in Lumen Gentium, the Church Fathers, the Council Fathers ask, okay, can others who are not Catholics or who do not belong to our religion, not of any fault of their own, but by an ignorant choice or just simply, an illusory choice, or they're deceived into a choice, but they think they're following their consciences and they're trying to pursue God as best they know Him. Would those people, be saved as well? And the answer to the question is the Council Father said yes, they can be saved by the action, the redemptive action of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, and that in point of fact, if they meet those requirements of trying to follow God as best they know and following their conscience, right, the moral integrity, right, as best they know, right, yes, then the salvation afforded by Christ is available to them. So that's set out in the Second Vatican Council. And if your person, your relative there, if he is truly thinking that he, is pursuing God and his conscience, and he's really been deceived by some people. And there are some very, very persuasive,
Right.
people out there who are trying to have people, abandon their Catholic faith. Then he could almost innocently, or she could almost innocently be pursuing this, in which case God would make heaven available to them. But I would say this to them. I would just say, hey, listen, I don't think you've got the full truth here. I don't think you're really aware of everything that's going on. I'll tell you what, I don't want to sit there and argue with you every time we meet.
Right.
But, I just want to keep the door open. If you start having doubts about this person, or you start having doubts about the doctrine that you're hearing, or you start having doubts, that what's going on here, is authentic religion or is authentically Christ, please,
Right.
call me day or night at midnight. Just call me. I really want to talk to you about this, because normally when people kind of come out of their illusion, or come out of, sometimes being majorly deceived, they already are aware that there's something inauthentic going on here. There's something very un-Christ-like going on here. Something begins to show itself, as it were. The devil shows his own, a little bit of the tail there, as it were. You start getting a sense, there's something very wrong going on here, or I think there's something very wrong going on here. And then keep the invitation open for that person to truly come to you day or night to talk about this. Because if they're on to the deceit, or they're on to a charlatan, or they're on to inauthenticity, or they're on to something un-Christ-like, then you can, that's the occasion to really bring them back into the doctrine of the church. And of course, that's where they will be vouchsafed. But I think you can depend, if they really are deceived, you can depend on God's mercy to, at the end of the day, help them.
And certainly pray for them that they'd be enlightened, or they could also check out.
Certainly pray for them.
They could also check out magicenter.com and get some additional information.
Exactly.
EWTN.com as well. Here's another question just before we take a break. In the last segment, I think we'll have you pick up what you were talking about earlier and do some further explaining as we talked about the soul. But here's maybe our last question, at least the question for this segment. My daughter wants to know the answer to this. In our Catholic Church, I believe it is said that we have the ability to make our own choices, yet how can we make our own life choices with God already knowing the destiny of our soul? And this is many thanks from Angela. So that whole idea of some level of predestination or control or the elect versus free will.
Yeah, this gets into probably the most complex theological question that there is, and it's called God's knowledge of future contingents. And the church is very clear on this. God does know what our destiny is, and so you say, well, how can that be? Because after all, I'm in the present moment. It's my free choice in the present moment. How could God be aware of a decision that I haven't made yet if I'm truly free? And the church answers that by saying that God's notion of time is different from your notion of time. God's awareness of the full context of the horizon of time is very, very different from your viewpoint of the present moment, the unfolding of your choices in the present moment. God does not see the unfolding of your present choices as something that is happening in the future. He sees the unfolding of your choices through a non-temporal lens that actually enables him, to, as it were, collapse into a single moment the variety of choices that you are making over the course of what you perceive to be the time, both internal time and external time of the physical universe, which God is not limited by. He's simply not limited by. So, in other words, you can freely choose, things going in the present, going into your future, and you can do that continuously. But God doesn't see your future as the future. God sees, the whole of time, as it were, in an eternal now, to use the words of St. Augustine. And because of that, he can have knowledge of future contingents without interrupting your free choice. Now, Calvin got really stuck on this, and John Calvin, and he basically could not fathom that view of a future that was not unfolding for God as it unfolds for us in a temporal succession. He couldn't conceive of it. And because he couldn't conceive of it, right? And by the way, we have all kinds of views today in science where we talk about time in very different ways. But let's go back to Calvin for a second. And he couldn't conceive it. And because he couldn't conceive of it, he really thought that God's awareness of the future would absolutely have to condition the choice that you make in your present. That's not God's present. And God's knowledge of your choice, in his future is not your future. He didn't see that. And because of that, he really believed that you were completely predestined and that free choice was really an illusion because it was canceled out by God's knowledge of future contingents. But you can actually have both. If you begin to conceive that God is outside of time and does not have a future or a present in a succession, does not experience the present and the future in a succession as you do. So I would not worry about God's knowledge of the future, and at the same time, that conditioning your ability to choose right now, fully anew, without any precondition of that choice for your present and your future.
So you can't say the devil made me do it or God made me do it, because basically at the end of the day it's your decision.
Or I'm, fatalism. And honestly, John Calvin's doctrine does get into a fatalism, without any question. I mean, it's basically, the whole of life is a fait accompli, so you're, even though you see it as succeeding, your decision is already predetermined.
You're basically an automaton who's just going through the motions. Okay, very good. We're going to take a break and much more with Father Spitzer and the evidence for the soul. He's going to get into some deeper explanations in our final segment. Stay with us. And we're talking about the evidence for the soul. I'm Doug Keck here on Father Spitzer's Universe with Father Spitzer out on our West Coast, answering your questions and talking about evidence for the soul. Father, why don't you, earlier in the show, you kind of talked about some of the overall focus of this whole concept, and you wanted to talk a little bit more, and we know that we're going to have to continue next week with the show just to get through everything, but do you want to give us an overview at this point?
Sure. There are 7 kinds of evidence for the soul that have come out in the contemporary period. Now, some of these kinds of evidence go back to ancient times, especially with Plato and St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. However, many of them are really quite contemporary. Let me just go through the different kinds of evidence, and then in next week we can talk about them in detail and maybe even get some questions about them.
Okay.
Number one, you have heard me probably talk about the linguistic anthropological evidence for a soul. This comes from a book by Noam Chomsky and Robert Berwick called Why Only Us? And it really is taking a look at what happened 70,000 years ago that gave rise to human beings having a universal syntactical linguistic revolution, to the multiplicity of languages languages, to a universal grammar and syntax, but in addition to that, burying their dead, artistic and symbolic representations on the walls of the caves, mathematical counting, proclivity, and abstract mathematics, social norms in the law, etc. So we call this kind of argument a linguistic, anthropological argument. So we'll take a look at that. What happened 70,000 years ago? Secondly, a topic which I've taken on this program before, which is called near-death experiences. And we're going to be looking specifically at the near-death experiences in medical studies, good longitudinal peer-reviewed medical studies published in good peer-reviewed journals, right, that, taking a look at the evidence that the soul will survive bodily death, particularly veridical evidence, particularly the blind being able to see after death, particularly the kinds of, going over to the other side and getting information from relatives one didn't know of previously, et cetera. So talk about the ways in which this has been really scientifically analyzed and studied. The third area that we're going to be looking at is a traditional argument, the 5 transcendental desires, which I was just hinting at the beginning of this program, that desire for perfect truth, perfect love, perfect goodness or fairness, perfect beauty, and perfect home. And those 5 transcendental desires betray our awareness of things we could have never gotten from this earth or gotten from our brain. In other words, the awareness of perfect truth, right, that's beyond any physical process, and it's beyond anything we can experience in the world. The awareness of perfect love is beyond the physical processes of our brain, beyond what we can experience in the world. The same thing with the awareness of perfect fairness or goodness, perfect beauty, and perfect home. So we'll talk about that in an Augustinian argument, which has been re-articulated by many, many people, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Bernard Lonergan, so many other wonderful arguments on the 5 transcendental kinds of awareness. The fourth area that we're going to talk about is the whole area, and this we may even have to go into another show, I don't know, but the difference between what we call syntactical language and just mere perceptual ideas. And there's a big distinction in the 20th century between perceptual ideas, which animals have, right, like chimpanzees can have, and why they can learn certain American signs, but they can never, understand a real sentence that has syntax in it, like the difference between dog bites man and man bites dog. Mm-hmm. We see, for example, chimpanzees, they can be taught 165, characters in American Sign Language, all of which represent perceptual ideas, which I'll explain next week. But with all of those signs, they can't, distinguish a subject from a predicate or a subject from an object, and therefore the joke that makes a little child chortle, the idea of man biting dog, they don't understand it at all or be able to distinguish it. And so we have to understand why not? Because they don't have conceptual ideas. They only have perceptual ideas. And we're going to talk about what's necessary to have a conceptual idea, and we'll get into the whole world of heuristic notions, and this is a fascinating world of the soul, mm-hmm. the kind of language that we have, the kind of understanding that we have. Then we get into a fifth area, which is the area of mathematics. A very famous mathematician by the name of Kurt Gödel. And Gödel actually had a proof which shows that the way that human beings, understand mathematics and grasp mathematical intelligibility has to be completely transalgorithmic. That is to say, it can't be based on a set of programs or rules that are, programmed into a human mind. It's always transcending the previous set of algorithms, always transcending the previous set of programs and rules. So human beings completely transcend artificial intelligence or computer intelligence altogether. And of course, we want to take a look at that Gödel proof, because what it's showing is that human beings have some kind of an awareness of mathematical intelligibility at its highest level from the get-go. Mm-hmm. And that's how mathematicians create new mathematical laws, right? You can feed it into a computer, but a computer can never do it because a computer is dependent on the previous set of algorithms. Very, very fascinating argument for a soul on the basis of this trans-algorithmic, this understanding of mathematical intelligibility at its highest level, which of course can't be experienced and can't be explained by a physical process. Then we'll go to a sixth area, which is very, very fascinating indeed. It's coming out with a philosopher by the name of David Chalmers at Oxford University right now, called The Hard Problem of Consciousness. And this deals with the inwardness of human subjectivity and the fact that the inwardness of human subjectivity cannot be explained by a physical process. Other arguments have articulated it in a slightly different way. Chalmers talks about our experiencing of our experiencing. This is what gives rise to this inwardness of subjectivity. And how can you explain this in a physical process? Because if you're going to experience yourself experiencing or be aware of yourself being aware, you're going to have to be in two relative positions with respect to yourself at the same time, and no physical process, not even a quantum process, can do this. Now, Stu Hamaker and Roger Penrose, a famous physicist and famous biologist, have tried to explain the Gödel proof and tried to look into the Chalmers contingents. But honestly, Chalmers, is just rising up, showing that there can be no physical process that can explain the experiencing of experiencing, and of course, it can't come from the outward experience itself. Again, there's something transcendental, something like a soul that is, out there that is really making this occur. And so when you put all of these kinds of evidence together, they form this big, huge, comprehensive, a sevenfold grounding of the evidence for a soul in the contemporary period, and especially with these near-death experiences, the transcendental desires, the self-consciousness and inwardness of human subjectivity of Chalmers, Gödel's proof, which I think is amazing itself, and of course that linguistic anthropological argument. You start putting this stuff together, I mean, you almost have to be, actively trying to deny the existence of a transmaterial, transphysical soul. You almost have to try to deny it. The evidence for it is so overwhelming. And so, of course, this is not some kind of fiction that people have developed. The contemporary materialist is a person, a contemporary physicalist is a person who just has adamantly set themselves against the transcendent and the transphysical, despite the fact, by the way, that, with the transphysical evidence of a soul from near-death experiences, people like Mario Beauregard, who is a neuroscientist at Arizona State University, have shown that all the physicalist arguments, are completely paltry. They don't work anyway. So for all intents and purposes, what's going on with this denial of materialism, a denial of the soul, and this physicalism? What's going on here? The problem is not a lack of evidence. The evidence is out there for anyone who is at least remotely open and willing to look at what's going on in these 7 areas I've been talking about. That's not the problem. The problem is I don't want to believe in transcendence because transcendence implies a God who I might be responsible to. Or I don't want to believe in transcendence because I want to believe only in what I can see. And of course, that of course is like giving yourself a frontal lobotomy just for the heck of it, just as a matter of opinion. I mean, why would you do it? I mean, people do what they do. But my point is, this is not rationally motivated, and it's not based on good evidence. The evidence favors the soul, and as we'll see in the next week when we start explaining some of these remarkable kinds of data, I think we'll see that, religion makes a lot of sense. And then when we add to it that the soul is the vehicle through which, God communicates to human beings in the Numinous Experience, I think we'll find there's not only good evidence for transcendentality, not only good evidence for the immortality of a soul, there is also very good evidence for man's religious grounding in God Himself, who is present to human beings from the beginning. So that's what we can look forward to. That's a short little, précis of this overwhelming evidence in a book I've got called The Soul's Upward Yearning.
Right.
And if you take a look at that, then I work it out in great detail. But this is just a little précis of what we're going to discuss next week.
Right. That certainly was short, but compact and packed with information. Just before we go, here's a quick question, kind of related, but not directly. Here's the question. Father, will we know each other's sins in heaven? Now, I'm assuming if you're in heaven, you don't have any sins, but maybe they meant the ones that they had before they got there. This person said it would be hard for me to face others knowing all of my sins. This is Jim, who sounds like he would actually be self-conscious about this kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's right. I think you can help him out, can't you?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously, there is no reason for anybody besides God to know anybody's sins in heaven. There's absolutely no reason for it. And for all intents and purposes, is this going to help anything in the kingdom of God? No. Is this going to help the love relationship in the kingdom of God? No. Is this the kind of knowledge that people need to know in the beatific vision to be whole? No. All of that stuff, it becomes literally insignificant, and God, of course, will protect that kind of privacy. There's no need for anyone except you and God to know those things, and of course God would not reveal them to anyone in the kingdom of heaven, because of course that would be completely contrary to his purpose of enabling people to love perfectly in sublime joy with him. I mean, absolutely will not happen. You can be sure of that.
Okay, let me ask you another question. When people talk about the soul and somebody says, my spirit, is there a difference between talking about the soul and the spirit?
Well, yes. Now, in the language of mysticism, there is, and in the language of St. Paul, there is. But, for all intents and purposes, the soul and the spirit have been collapsed into one another, really, when we're talking about it from the vantage point of the transphysical agency of, capable of transcendental awareness and desire, which is going to survive bodily death, and the vehicle through which God communicates with us. So when, if that's what we mean by soul, and that's the way the soul is spoken about in the modern period, both, from the vantage point of science, from philosophy and theology, that common notion of the soul, then you would say that there really isn't a major distinction between soul and spirit. Now, in the view of St. Paul, the soul could be distinguished as the organizing principle, right, or in Aristotelian view, as the organizing principle that allows us to have our syntactical language and allows us, to survive the immortality of the soul, to survive bodily death. But the real vehicle for St. Paul through which God communicates to us is the Spirit. So he does differentiate that. And of course, many of the mystics, particularly St. John of the Cross, follow him in this, and that distinction between soul and spirit is definitely put into the language of what we call mystical theology in the church. But it shouldn't get you worried, because of course in the technical, scientific, philosophical definition of soul, it includes spirit. But in the language of Paul, in the language of mysticism, the spirit is something different, but somehow communicates with the soul. So therein lies the distinction.
Sounds perfect there, Father. Thank you for clearing that part up for us as well. And we've got to say so long for you for this week. And we're going to continue talking about the soul with Father Spitzer coming up next week. We'll see you then, Father. Thank you so much. And that's What is the Evidence for Soul, Part 2. Always great. And don't forget, we've got some wonderful encore airings of this program if you missed it. 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific on Thursday nights, and also Saturday at midnight and Friday at 9 p.m. Pacific. And don't forget, we're on radio on Saturday, also now on Friday nights. And just go to EWTN.com. You'll find out all the information about Father Spitzer's show and all the other great programs we have here at EWTN that you should be checking out on a regular basis. And I'm Doug Keck. Thank you for joining us at the intersection of faith and reason, the one and only Father Spitzer's universe. Join us next time. See you then.